thank you so much for joining us, everyone who's on the call today. We have a bit of a smaller group, which I'm a little bit excited about today because it means we're going to get more time for questions and to get really intimate into this conversation. So today we are having a masterclass all about how to host a diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation. This is a follow-up to a fantastic event that Karen hosted last week too. So the lovely Karen Craigs-Milne has joined us today to address all your questions and to offer some insight into your specific use cases, what we're talking about today. And my name is Tila Beischer. If you haven't attended a masterclass before, hello, it's fantastic to meet you. I'm a customer success manager here. So I work with thought partners primarily in education to help them to plan and execute their events. And here's what we are going to cover today. Okay, so we are looking at all of the details of running a DE&I exchange, or as Karen will dig into a little bit, DE&I exchanges, because these are rarely singular conversations. Really why we wanted to offer this and why we've been focusing on this is that people and organizations across the world are being called to dismantle systemic and institutional racism. There are so many marginalized groups of people who continue to require the attention of your organization. And some ways that people are experiencing othering and marginalization in the workplace are based on national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, marital status, disability, genetic characteristics, a conviction for which a pardon has been granted or a record suspended, and many more reasons. And so creating a diverse, inclusive, and equitable organization starts with listening. And it starts with understanding the challenges that your people are currently experiencing so that you can address them effectively through meaningful actions. Exchanges provide an inclusive and equitable platform to bring people together. And so that's where we come in today. What we want to take are these conversations that we need to have. They are difficult, they are really important. They're about bringing people together and taking action against racism and systemic inequities. And to teach you a little bit about the how, so the technical side, and then Karen's going to bring in the why for us as well. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about objectives and goals, thinking about what do you need to know from the exchange and how will that inform your planning and communication. We're going to have a tutorial as always in these classes, and then we're going to wrap up with a Q&A exchange. We are scheduled for 30 minutes. We might run a little bit longer so that we have time to get through all of the Q&A exchange. Because we're a smaller group too, we can explore some other ways to make it a little bit more interactive at the end there. I'm happy to welcome you, come off of mute to ask your questions too. Karen, anything you want to add there?
Oh, that's great. I'm looking forward to following your lead and adding where I can.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, I'll be calling you in lots. Perfect. So let's start digging into objectives. And as with every exchange, this is really the starting point with planning. It's thinking about why are you running the exchange? And for DE&I exchanges, this can look like a few different things. And I'm going to list a few, but please know that these are not the only objectives that you could have with this exchange topic or exchange style. Maybe you're trying to create a safe space to foster open dialogue, trying to identify gaps in your resources so your team can create more professional development opportunities, trying to organize or identify how systemic racism shows up in your organization, and then what you could do to resolve that, and many other reasons. Karen, are there any other objectives that are coming to mind for you?
Oh, lots. So for most organizations, you're at a certain place in the journey. So perhaps you're starting out and you want to make sure that you're listening to voices to help you design and build and prioritize. Others have already got a strategy in place and they can use Thoughtexchange to get feedback on whether the strategy resonates, where does it drop the ball, is it working, what can we do to help the implementation. So right all the way through to, you know, reviewing how have we done in the last year, what progress have we made. You can have so many conversations around this work using Thoughtexchange.
Yeah, I love that you've emphasized regardless of where your organization is at, an exchange can complement this work. So here are a few questions that you could ask yourself to really think about where your organization is at. If you're thinking about why you're running this exchange, where do you need to start? what conversations have happened so far, and then what type of information do you need to gather to move the needle forward? Do you think that there are any conversations that are happening that you're not aware of, that you want to bring into the scope of your organization so you could all address them together? Another really important detail is what type of information are you gathering? And more importantly, how do you plan to use it? So with these exchanges, a large part of them being successful is that they inform an action or they inform a next step, a next conversation too. Karen talks all the time about how these are iterative. It's not a single exchange answers the question, solves the problem. We found all the answers, it's not a problem anymore. This is something that we are going to be addressing over the long term. And so how can we start to build that sequence and pull on the different threads? And that leads right into your communication. So if you're thinking about who your participants are and what they want to get out of it as well, how are you communicating that value to them? And so exchanges are designed to be really inclusive practices. Your participants are sharing their voice and they're rating the thoughts of others. They're naturally interacting with others that they may not always based on silos of communication. And so that's building transparency. It's building learning, building listening. And which stakeholders do you want to invite into this process? What are the groups that you're going to start with? And when you start considering who those people are, your communication plan almost naturally builds itself. You think of who your stakeholders are, how do they naturally like to be communicated with? Do you send them exchange or information over Slack? Do you email them? Is having a meeting with them the best way to welcome them into the exchange? And another strategy too is to think about, do you have any stakeholder groups who you want to hear from, who you don't always hear from? So I'm thinking, because I work in education, I work with a lot of school districts who have other languages spoken in their community who don't always get invited into district conversations. So because exchanges can be ran in any language supported by Google Translate, suddenly you have an opportunity to invite that group of people into a conversation that they traditionally may not have been able to join. So what are the ways that you need to get the word out there to them that they're able to join these exchanges? Do you have any liaisons? Do you have any champions that you can partner with in that way too? And this final question prompt here, this is a big one that we talk about with this style of exchanges, is accountability. And what I mean by that is exactly what this question is asking you on this slide. What are you willing to learn? And what are you willing to take action on in response to what you're going to learn from these exchanges? Accountability is not just you, it's also your team too. So is your team willing to take this accountability and to move forward with that work? Karen, do you have anything to add on to that there?
Absolutely, very important to come into these conversations not only to listen, but also with a commitment to look for actions that you can take that will show that you are committed to doing the work and working through things, even if you don't have the answers. I think the two things that come to mind around communication are that it's really important that we consider who the communication is coming from. And sometimes you're going to have a much better response. This is in general, not just with Thoughtexchange, but in general, you know, if you're having the CEO send this out and say it's really important, it's part of a very important, you need to prioritize this, you may get better engagement than if it was coming out from a DE officer, for example. So thinking about how do we leverage, because you're doing it once, how do we leverage the right channel to make sure that it's getting the attention and the time that it deserves? And then related to that, the second piece would be around communication, would be to let people know that they will be receiving the results back as part of a process of maintaining transparency. So they know that whatever is coming in is also going to be available for them afterwards to look at.
Perfect. And you've led exactly into the next slide here, which is thinking about expectations, right? And that's exactly what you just outlined, Karen. It's, oh, Anna, we've just moved to the next one. I'm hoping that you're seeing the next slide about communications now. But really what you're thinking about are what are the expectations for people receiving results? You always want to be able to say, we're sharing the results back by this date, and then actually deliver upon that. And that activity of setting the expectation and then sharing the results back actually starts to build trust It's showing I heard you and I'm delivering on my promise here, so people are more likely to participate in the next exchange. Another detail when you're thinking about your planning and communications is this aspect here of partnerships. And that is that this work doesn't have to happen in isolation. And in fact, it shouldn't happen in isolation. If you can partner with your other leadership team, with others in your organization to be planning these exchanges, or if you can partner with activists, diversity and inclusion educators and practitioners, or leaders within marginalized group to provide guidance on the exchange question, on the messaging, on the tone of your communications, and to review the thoughts shared, then you can speak up and say, I'm not necessarily an expert on this, but I've partnered with others who are really passionate about this work too. All right, and then this other factor here about being right. And I love this topic because as a leader, you might not get everything right. And this can feel like a really scary conversation to open. It's a really important one to have, and that kind of adds an additional layer of pressure, right? To have it, you know that you want it to go well, and that fear of being right when you're having the critical conversations. So what I always encourage is to really be leaning into the vulnerability of that. You can be transparent with your organization that this is your first exchange about this, or that this is your first time talking about this in this way, and acknowledge what your organization needs to do to improve. Karen, do you have any thoughts about that little area about being right?
Yes, one thing that comes to mind is that people are often fearing having the conversation because they're worried that there will be dissenting voices. I think it's important to frame the conversation from the beginning to say, we're not looking for only one perspective or, one idea. Like there is no right or wrong. There simply is a diversity of experiences and ideas and opinions. And we are creating an inclusive space to capture all of that as long as it's respectful. And that's really important because there are people who may feel like you're leaning too much into DE&I and that, this wasn't what we signed up for. And it seems like being too politically correct. You want those people to also have their voice in this conversation, because what it does is it allows them to also feel heard and acknowledged, and it gives you a space to actually address some of those concerns head on when you're doing the debrief on the findings. And that's super important because, when we say we don't want to leave anyone behind, that includes people who are really uncomfortable with where this is going, and ensuring that you create the space for them and their concerns to be heard is part of being inclusive and equitable.
Thanks for that, Karen. So we're going to move into a bit of a tutorial now. What I want is for you all to leave knowing what are the different settings available in the product. I'm curious, can you use the raise hand function if you've set up an exchange before, or if for some of you this is going to be your very first experience seeing exchanges created? All right, looks like we're mainly a group of people for whom Thoughtexchange is new. So let's hop in and look at the platform together today. So this is a Thoughtexchange room. This is where exchanges are created and managed. And an exchange at its most basic is the single open-ended question that you're asking, and people share and respond to that question. And so if we're going to create an exchange, the easiest way to do it and the fastest place to get started is in the exchange gallery. And this is an area that is currently being looked at by Karen and her team and her colleagues to add some additional information to. So if you haven't seen this before, the exchange gallery is a resource library for you. It's templates of exchanges. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is to explore through the exchange gallery, primarily focusing on this diversity, equity, and inclusion, these three modules that we have here. What you're going to find are questions that we are recommending that you ask to start this work. And so you can see questions about what are some important perspectives we should consider regarding diversity, equity, and belonging. What systems should we be creating? What measures do we need to put in place? So you can see that if you're thinking about a change management process, we're going from start to finish here. It's not just one for the entire process. There's different variants depending on where you're at, as Karen highlighted earlier. If you're going to use one of these questions, all you do is click on Create Exchange, and the exchange launches for you, and then you can share it out. But I'm not going to let you get off that easy today. We're going to go through the actual manual creation so that you know how some of the different settings will impact the eventual outcome of these exchanges. So when we're thinking about designing an exchange specifically for diversity, equity, inclusion, we're thinking about how can we keep it as open, as inclusive as possible, and keep it focused as well. And so as always, we can pop in the exchange question. I'm just going to use that sample one that we found. What are some important perspectives we should consider? In an introduction, you have the opportunity to add some additional context for people to read before they participate. And I really recommend exploring how you can use this to guide people to feel that it is a safe space, to let them know what your goals are, why are you running this exchange and what do you want to get out of it, and why are you having them participate in the exchange? So what's the value of these participants spending the time in the exchange? Also, this is where you could mention, we are going to share results back with you on this date. Like Karen highlighted, the importance of sharing those results back with people. Set that expectation in the introduction here. Karen, anything else that you can think about that is really important to include in introductions?
Yes, one way that you can make it really engaging is with a video where you're delivering your message on screen and personally. And I find that people respond really well to that.
Yeah, add that human element, add the video in. Yeah, so if you are going to record a video, doesn't need to be the most amazingly produced video. Could be just you talking to your camera screen like this. You can upload it as a file or a YouTube link, whichever works best for your preferences. Survey questions are an opportunity here for you to gather some quantitative data to accompany the qualitative data that you gather from the process of sharing and rating. And what you might want to explore here are having some targeted questions to start getting some KPIs of where your organization is at and how people are responding to this work. So a good example of that could be thinking about how satisfied are you or how diverse do you think that our organization is? Another one could be, are you interested in joining our Diversity and Equity Council if that's the work that you're doing? These are close-ended questions that allow you to gather a little bit of additional data about your participants. Karen, any survey questions that you've seen that you thought have been really impactful for this style of work?
Yes, so one that you can track over time is how comfortable are you engaging in these conversations? And you'll see if you run it over and over again, you should see the, the number of people who are very comfortable growing as you have these conversations over time. The other one is that you can do this by department. So breaking it down by department, breaking it down by demographic factors such as age, ethnicity. You can look at specific roles or even locations, geographic locations. If you're a large organization and you want to know, how did UK answer this question versus Canada versus some other offices? So, the key thing here in determining what questions to ask is to ask yourself after the fact, once I have these results, how would I want to cut them up to be able to see differences? What differences are relevant that I would need to be pulling out, either because my leadership will want to see it or because there are great differences and contextual differences that I need to take into account. And then you build them into the survey questions up front.
Thank you. I'm going to click on save here. The other detail that you'll really want to consider with these exchanges is moderation. And moderation is the act of keeping a conversation focused and appropriate, but not censoring the conversation, really importantly. So if you haven't seen these features before, moderation allows for your participants to flag each other's thoughts, and those can either be left in until you review them or removed until you review them. And there's also an option to use the machine moderation that we have, which is an algorithm that is watching thoughts to make sure that they are appropriate so they don't have anything rude or hurtful or identifying. And when you're thinking about using these tools, I'm always encouraging you to think about how vulnerable can we be and how transparent can we be while still keeping the conversation focused. So if you're using something like machine reporting for identifying thoughts, assumedly you're using it because you don't want the conversation to be focusing on any one person. You don't want someone to say, X person is X. What you want is to talk about the organization or the issue as a whole. However, with this, there's always the risk of a false positive. If someone put in something like Martin Luther King Jr., because it's a name, it would flag it out. So what you're going to want to do is to measure the balance of that. If perhaps an exploration here could be to turn them on, but to be reviewing them quite often, or to turn them on, but to leave the thoughts in once they are flagged so that you're just reviewing them quite often. The takeaway for you with moderation too is that it's going to look different depending on the groups that you're reaching out to. If you were reaching out internally to your leadership team, likely you would turn moderation off. You'd have all these set to off because you're trusting your leadership team to share appropriately and be focused. If you were reaching out to a larger district community, maybe you would turn more of these on so that you have a bit of a safety net in place. Karen, any thoughts on moderation and censorship?
I think you hit the nail on the head. And what I would say is most of the time people are pretty respectful. And sometimes when you're unsure of it, it's great to set that up in the introduction as well, to say, we're looking for a respectful conversation.
Perfect. All right, so the final detail that I really want to share with you when you're thinking about these is to consider how you want to host the exchange. And what I mean by that is exchanges could be live. So we're going to go through a live one in a couple minutes here during a virtual event, during a virtual meeting, or they can be asynchronous, meaning that you share the link out with your stakeholders and they participate on their own times. There's benefits to both. When you're live in a room, it can feel really powerful to have a vulnerable conversation all together. And you're also going to often find that your participation is increased because there's that accountability piece of being all together. However, for those noodlers who want more time to think, or they want to come back and have the opportunity to participate over a longer period of time, an asynchronous exchange might be a better option. So you could do one or the other. A lot of the times you could explore comboing them. Maybe you're having your exchange open for a week, but you do have a team meeting at which you can have everyone participate live together. That might be a really good option. Okay, so that's the tutorial component that we wanted to review with you today. What we're going to do now is move into a Q&A with myself and with Karen, asking all of your questions that you have. So I'm going to set that up. We're going to use an exchange to go through this. We are a fairly small group today, so we should be able to get through the Q&A pretty quickly. And as mentioned, we are going to go over a little bit of time past 1:30, 2:30, whatever time that it is in your time zone, and we will share the recording out if you need to drop. And I am setting this up here so you can see exactly how fast that setting up exchanges could be if you were in a situation like this and wanted to run one. Save, launch, and then we are going to use presenter mode. So if you haven't seen this before, this is exactly how you run live exchanges. Just click on presenter mode and then you can join using the QR code, or I'm going to grab the link and pop it into the chat if you want to share in the chat here. Fantastic. And we are going to spend 4 minutes on this. So I'm going to click on play. Please share your questions, share your thoughts. What we can also do is, because we're a smaller group, happy to take you off of mute if you want to speak to your questions once we move into the answering step. And if you're having any difficulties getting in, just let me know in the chat. like we don't have any thoughts rolling in yet, no questions yet. So I can add an extra minute onto the timer here. I'll give us an extra 30 seconds so we all have time to share. All right, we have about a minute and a half left. So there's a couple of thoughts that have been shared here. If you haven't made it to the rating step, and I see there are a few people who are new to Thoughtexchange here, be sure to hop in there and rate some of the thoughts. What we'll use is the highest rated thoughts to talk through. We don't have a ton, so we should be able to get through all of these today. All right, well, it looks like we have a smaller group today, just a few really focused questions. So we could end a little bit early and really dig in. This top one here, Karen, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this while we're still sharing how to get leadership of big organizations on board to engage with staff in this way. Some previous employee engagement work means now there is fear amongst senior leadership to open up this conversation.
So my experience around this has been to give them the experience of Thoughtexchange as a new way of having the conversation themselves. And so I've done this with other clients where we had the executive team experience Thoughtexchange, and then they were so amazed with, you know, the insights and the experience that they said, okay, let's open it up to the senior managers. So then we had a Thoughtexchange with only the senior managers to ask them, if we want to roll this out, what are your thoughts? What should we take into account? How can we engage all your different teams? And then, so it did two things. It gave them the experience of Thoughtexchange. And at the same time, it gave them an opportunity to discuss what were their concerns, what would they do differently, what have they learned in the past, and how do we want to use this tool to really create meaningful inclusion. And it works every time. It's pretty amazing.
I like that highlight of building slow, right? Moving through the layers and getting the buy-in slowly too.
And we have to remember that senior leadership is very risk averse. So they do need to feel comfortable, and that you do need their buy-in for moving this forward. And the best way to do it is help them experience this themselves.
All right, well, let's look at this next one. I'm new to the use of this platform. Is it comparable to systems like Padlet to collect responses? I'm not very familiar with Padlet. How Thoughtexchange works and really its magic is that people share their response to an open-ended question and then they rate the thoughts of others. And it is entirely confidential and anonymous. So people are interacting with the thoughts of others without knowing who shared them, which builds a lot of trust and vulnerability and empathy in the process. And for you as an exchange leader, your real value is that you're able to understand how people truly feel. Because they're not just sharing, they're also rating. You get to understand what's important to your group and to all of your stakeholders as a whole. If you're interested in learning more about Thoughtexchange, we do host an event series called Discover Thoughtexchange on Wednesdays. And that's a really good landing place for you to start. You can go through a demo and hear all about how it works and how it compares to other tools. This next one here, What are your suggestions on level setting around language? How much to put in the intro versus share in another way? Important for people to have shared language when engaging in these conversations. Curious what your thoughts are on this, Karen.
So there's many different ways to approach it. One would be to create a lexicon of language, equity, diversity, anti-racism, some of the key language that we expect and anticipate people to be using, and to share that along with your introductory email, which will not, so it's kind of like an attachment or a separate piece, but you're giving it for them to review and read in advance of engaging in a thought exchange. So we've talked to some people about doing that if they feel it's important, or you could do an intro session depending on how big your group is and actually do a review of the language as part of getting ready to do a thought exchange. So maybe part one is we're going to review the language so we're all speaking in the same way about the same concepts. And then following that, we're going to do a thought exchange where now we're on the same page about language. We can really listen to what you have to say. But you can also ask people to avoid using jargon and to just use simple English and simple language, simple terms, and to just speak openly about what they're thinking about without that language getting in the way, right? So I think there's 3 different options there for you to think about.
And Karen did that very well for us here at Thought Exchange. We really learned together. We did that session that she spoke about. So to level set, build that language together before we dove into the work as an organization. All right, so we did have one question or two questions rolling up at the top here. How does Karen speak to the value of and the need for this work? I often end up rambling so much and would love some tips. A good question.
Well, it really, I honestly tailor what I say to whoever I'm speaking to and what their specific interest or need will be. So, if you're talking to leadership, they have a very particular perspective. If you're talking to the board, it's a whole different perspective as well. So, and it depends on the type of company or organization. So I would say you need to tailor what you're saying to who you're speaking to. And you need to come at it not from what you want them to know, but what you think is relevant for them, connecting the dots with why this is important for their perspective. So if it's an organization that's consumed with the idea of how they're very white and Black Lives Matter is now out and they're worried about perceptions, speak to that. Speak to how other organizations are being proactive around this and are addressing this issue as a way to manage risk. If you're very, social justice oriented, speak to the fact that this is the right thing to do. If you're very business case oriented, speak to the fact that research shows, there's about at least 11, if not, in fact, in one case, I saw 29 different research statistics around why having inclusive conversations and investing in diversity and inclusion leads to higher revenue generation. So, I don't think it's a one fits all conversation. You really need to figure out what's important to them and what will resonate with them, and then lead with that.
Which could ultimately inform that communication strategy of perhaps you need to send out different messages to different groups to invite people to the same exchange.
Oh, and one thing that I did actually last week, which worked really well, was we asked the people that we were engaging with, we asked them, why do you think this is important? And we ran a whole thought exchange on that. So it wasn't even me trying to convince them that this was important. It was them convincing each other. So that's always a great way to do it.
Yeah, a good starting place for that too. Awesome. So one other question rolled through while we had these other ones up. What are some ways to poll staff about their thoughts on an organization's commitment to equity, informed decision-making, and professional development efforts?
So I would say there's a number of questions in here, a number of thought exchanges I see. So one is around your professional development efforts. So, asking them, what would you like to learn about when it comes to ED&I? What do you need? What do you feel is missing? What topics do you want us to cover? So I would build our learning plan, even for Thought Exchange. The learning plan that I'm going to create is based on having that input from the staff first, and then looking at, as an expert, what do I know that they need that they don't know that they need? And then merging the two together in a learning plan. So that's how I would approach it. And you can always, as part of that, if you're doing an ongoing learning plan, you can always ask questions in the survey section. Just say, have you been trained on, I've received training on ED&I previously, yes or no? And then, I'm very comfortable with the concepts, yes or no. And then at the end, you can ask the same questions, or the following time you can ask the same question. So there's different ways to gauge what through the survey questions, where people are at and what's moving in terms of the dial. And also when we're talking about the organization's commitment, that's a great survey question, really great survey question. And it can be two. It can be a survey question that you ask on an ongoing basis. How do you feel about the organization's commitment? Just keep asking that with every thought exchange and see if it changes over time. For us, it changed very quickly from not so sure we're doing enough to, yeah, we're very confident and very satisfied with the kind of actions that you're taking as an organization. But when you look at what we actually did was listen and then let people know that we were listening, as opposed to jumping straight into action. So it doesn't often take too much actual work to get to a place where people start to feel really good about what you're doing, and then gives you the time to build more intentionally moving forward. You want to add to that, Tila?
Yeah, I was going to say, I was having a conversation actually with a leader this morning about this topic, is how do I measure the impact of these exchanges over time? And I love that suggestion of asking the same survey question about how do you feel our commitment to equity is moving forward, or what is the progress, and measuring it over time, because it gives you the ability to have some measurable data points. So you're building KPIs into your process in what sometimes feels like a conversation that doesn't have metrics that could associate with it, because it's not always entirely measurable, right? Impact. So I love that suggestion, Karen. So those were all of our questions today. We had a little bit of a smaller group and we ran a little bit over time. So thank you to those of you who stuck around. I want to say a huge thank you to Karen for being here to support and to offer her wisdom and her advice. Karen, any last closing words?
Yeah, it's always great to work with you, Tila. This is always a really well thought out session. And I want to make an offer for anyone who's interested. I've been doing this work for 20 years, so I look at this not only as how do I run thought exchanges, but how do I create an effective DE&I strategy and use thought exchange to make sure that strategy is living and working well. So if you're interested in having a session with me to talk about your strategy or how we can leverage thought exchange to help you with that, please do reach out to Tila or anyone else in the company, and they'll set up a meeting time for us to meet. We can spend an hour talking about what you're working on and how we can help you.
Wonderful. Awesome. So you'll all be receiving our contact information in the follow-up, or if you're interested in that, you have my email address from the invite confirmation today. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Happy rest of your Monday and a wonderful week. Take care, all.